Hey everybody, welcome back. In this video we're going to go over session 6 of my Dungeons & Dragons campaign, Into the Realm of Chaos. This will be an analysis of what happened during the session, things I thought went well, and lessons or challenges I faced on things I think I can improve on moving forward. So last when we left our adventurers, they had just defeated Ugak the Omen, the leader of the Pike Horde, and had defeated the Rust Monster infestation as well at the same time. And in this silver mine, they explored and heard this magic mouth that gave them a riddle, which they completed, which opened up this secret chamber into a room that poured out blue light. And I honestly thought that this next part would go a bit quicker than what it did. This might have been a shortcoming of me explaining the room poorly, but here's what happened. As they entered into this room, they saw a chamber which was about 40 feet wide and 70 foot long. There were 6 pillars, 1 in each corner and 2 in the middle on each side. They were about 5 feet wide and 6 feet tall crystals that went into the ground. In the center of this room, there was a 10-foot statue of an elf with wings, and in front of this statue there was a 4-foot diameter circle made of all black, and above the black circle there was a sword pointing down, hovering in midair, and it was a very exquisite sword. It was crystal in nature and had an outline of white on the edges of the blade. The pommel was made of adamantine, and the hilt was made of green leather. Think of like the leaf leather in Lord of the Rings. And the pommel was a crystal. And just above that, there was a crystal that had been like exploded and then frozen in time, so you could like see every little thousands and thousands of pieces of it. On the far side of the room, there was an archway of pure blue light that poured out into the room, and it was lined with something, and it was in an arch. And the players entered, and they were fascinated about this circle of black. They thought it was a pool, and they thought it was a liquid. No matter how many times I told them it was not a liquid, they went up and tried to lick it. They put their hand through it. They dropped pebbles through it. They stuck their staff in it, and basically all that happened was whatever went in disappeared, and then they pulled it back out. If they dropped a pebble in it, didn't make any noises when it hit the bottom. Basically was an illusion. As they walked around it as well in the circle, they noticed that like there were little dots of white and they were like stars. So as they moved, they were like seeing different perspectives of the same illusion. And they went up to the statue and they read the inscription, which was in Elvish, which said, "Knight Arcturus, what we love, we protect." This was the sword of Arcturus, the legendary sword wielded by Knight Arcturus, one of the 6 knights. And they don't remember the story, which might have been a fault of my own. I posted on our Discord about like a month before the session 2 stories that were going to tie into the campaign. Both of them were just good stories to know, like your characters would know these things, as well as, you might encounter some of these things as the story progresses. I don't know how much of these artifacts they will find or interact with, but I was kind of disappointed that like when I said Knight Arcturus, they didn't all, like their ears didn't perk up. And again, that might have just been a shortcoming. I maybe could have reminded them like, hey, I review these videos. They might come in handy during the session. So that was a pitfall of mine that I could have done better, as well as I never said explicitly at the beginning that the archway was a door. I said doorway sometimes, and then sometimes I referred it to as a door. So they just thought it was a door of light. They didn't ever picture it as a portal, which hearing an archway of pure blue light kind of makes me think of a portal, but maybe I could have made it like have rippling effects. I did say that I had a humming noise to it. So first things first, Tink, the human artificer, scouted the whole room and looked for traps, which he didn't find any. They then tried to see if there were other swords inside of the crystal, like if this crystal sword in the middle had been a crystal originally and it was broken, which is why it's now this black circle. They weren't sure. And then tried to knock on the crystals and make some sort of noise. And then Tink, the human artificer, decided that he was going to grab the sword, and at that time he needed to roll a constitution save since he is not an elf. I rolled the wrong damage type. It was supposed to be force damage, but I said thunder damage. Tomato tomato in this case, doesn't really matter. Then some funny interactions occurred between the players during this time. Enzo then went up and picked up the sword. Olivax then went over to the doorway of light and put his ear up to it and said a prayer like, Bahamut, like, show me, is this the way? And then Waldo was like, Olivax, is your god a door? That was one of the highlights of the session. Then Olivax decided to put his head into the blackness since he didn't hear a response from Bahamut, his god, and then it was pitch black, of course, so he didn't have any light. He then got out his torch and put his head back in again. This time, he just saw a 5-foot pit like in the ground, and his face ran into it as he like reached down, and then he like had his legs flittering up at the top like, pull me back up, and Waldo was like, pull him up, he's gonna die. And so they pulled him up with urgency, and he was like, okay, it's just a dead end. Then Enzo, having the sword, went up and inspected the statue to see like if there were any hidden markings or engravings. They also tried to see if there were hidden markings and engravings on the wall, if there were any doors on the wall. Also, like I mentioned before in a previous campaign diary, the second they touched the sword, the door that they came into closed, so there was no way out, only way through. They seemed kind of trapped until Enzo said, I'm pull out a staff and I'm gonna poke the door of light and see what happens. And then I say, oh, the second you touch the light with your staff, you disappear. And then they were like, what? And Tink, who at this time was getting the crystal that had exploded in midair and like putting it all in his bag, was like trying to hurry up so he can go through. He's like super pumped to be able to go through this portal. They all eventually went through the portal and they got into another cave, and the cave was a cul-de-sac in shape, and it was like obsidian texture on the ground, and above them there were lit crystals that peppered the ceiling, and they were all different shades and colors, and they were very vibrant. Immediately Tink went and tried to break them off like stalactites, and I told him that they were still glowing, so him and Theron and Wink were like, it's payday time, let's fill our bags. So they started breaking them all off, and I told him like, as you throw them down, they're like softly going down and then like starting to hover back up. So they stuffed their bags, their backpacks were like up on their head as it was like so full. And then I told them after some time, these crystals start to dim and they start to become really, really heavy. So that will tie in later in about like 20 sessions from now, maybe more. So I'm excited to see what they're going to do with these crystals, as I have tied it into one of the major villains of my world. So then the rest of them decided to go look and see what was at the entrance of this cave. And as they all gathered, I explained it as you exit the cave, you are facing east and you see a vast forest in front of you of all shapes and colors, bright pinks, browns, blacks. You hear a noise and all the leaves from the tree just leave a skeleton of what the former self of the tree. You see all these different shapes as well in the tree, like as if picking out shapes in clouds. Then I explained that they saw a snake the size of a river with a head and a tail slithering through the landscape. And then they noticed that it actually was a river slithering through the landscape. It went up the mountainside, and as it did, it was creating reverse waterfalls, and then it settled in a coil and it created like a pond and became part of the landscape again. As they started to look more north, they saw clouds shuffling as if shuffling cards in the sky, and they saw swamplands. And then as they kept turning around, going from northwest back all the way behind them, they saw jagged mountains full of crystals protruding from the tops, purples and blues. Think of like crystal caverns from Dark Souls is a good imagery for like the size and the scope of what the size of these mountains were. And then back to the other side where they originated. They then were kind of confused with my description. So I told them, you guys have felt like this is kind of like a mirror of where you were before. Like you guys were in a mountain. There was forest about half a mile from you guys. However, there was no swamp, and they kind of made that connection. Like I had them roll some history checks, and then I basically told Enzo like, hey, you probably think you're in the Fey Realm. You've read stories about this. Elated emotions, vibrant colors that you've never seen before, as if like you've been cheated in your current world and they were muting the colors from you. So then they decided, okay, we're in a different place. This is scary. Let's go and take a rest. We're exhausted. We just fought. Theron had not slept since the day prior, so he was exhausted. So they went and slept. And then 2 players were not there this session. So before the session, I had them text me, hey, you're going to have a dream in this session. Can you text me what your character would be dreaming, good or bad? And then I had them all go around and tell me what their dreams were. So Theron's dream was Droll, the wizard who had done them wrong because they just forged his name to get some horses. He dreamt that this wizard was doing everything in his power to make it up to them. And then him and his brother went to a lavish party, and people were revering them, telling them they were great people, and they were like honored guests. So that was his dream. Wink's dream was short and sweet. It was a horrible dream. It was basically him envisioning his parents getting murdered over and over again, as he has been traumatized by Ida being killed by these orcs. Then Waldo's dream was more pleasant, where he was basically walking through the meadows with his companions, and he was finding all of the rocks that he ever wanted, and he was putting them in his bag, and then he was getting scared like he lost them, and then he was remembering all that they were still there, and that was giving him comfort. Then we went to Tink, who stayed up all night making his bag holding, which was part of his artificer class. I talked with him about this earlier, like, hey, if you want to roleplay staying up and working on things, I'm not going to give you a point of exhaustion. You're an inventor, someone who has crazy hours where they'll sleep in different parts of the day and stay up all night to work on things. If you're staying up to work on like like infusions, which is part of his character class. I'm not going to punish you, but if you're like wanting to stay up and read a book or like do something else that's not part of your class, then it would be exhaustion. So he stayed up tinkering on his backpack to make it a bag of holding so they could get more and more crystals, which was the point of that. Then we had Olivax give his dream, and he dreamt that he was in a marketplace full of dragon beings, and Bahamut gave him a quest to go up in the mountains and to pick him some flowers. And so he went up to the mountains and there was a bunch of gold, so he started collecting the gold, and Bahamut asked him why he was doing that. Olivax told him that gold is much more valuable than flowers, and then Bahamut was teaching him a lesson like, you're so practical, Olivax. This is so like you, but sometimes there are things that are worth more than gold, and that was his dream. And last was Enzo, the half-elf warlock, and he went last on purpose because before the campaign started, me and him discussed who his patron should be for his warlock class, and I decided that it's going to be Iglewiv or Tasha from Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, which I thought was interesting. I know sometimes she's portrayed as like an evil god or goddess or arch wizard. However, I wanted to portray her as more of like a neutral, and the background from her is she used to be with one of the demon lords, and then after being released from his basically possession, she fled and changed her name and went into the Fey realm, and she has now become like the Witch of Dreams. So I had her at the end of Enzo's dream, which was basically him being all excited and rethinking all of the decisions they've made and how his character has felt. I had her enter his dreams and saying, "Oh, I feel you close, and I feel that you have something very powerful on you," since he had the Sword of Arcturus. And she said, "I'm so glad that you're close, and because of this, I'm going to grant you and everyone in your party's dreams to come true." So the next morning when they woke up, Waldo had a bunch of stones in his bag of different colors. I said one of fuchsia and one white pebble, and he was so excited, and he spread them all out on the ground, and he was poking at him with his finger like you would poke at like Hot Wheel cars or something of that nature. And then they put all their stuff in the bag of holding, and then they left, and they decided that they were going to explore these other caves to see what was happening. And I didn't know where they were going to go. I presented they could go to the swamplands, they could go to the forest, and they could go to the other parts of the mountains. I had plot lines presented for all three of them. If they went to the swamplands, they would have had to rescue some creature's wife that had gone off looking for something and hadn't returned. If they went to the forest, then they would have encountered like pixies dealing with dryads and them clashing. And then if they went to the mountains, they would have dealt with this Fomorian and Topaz dragon debacle that was happening. So they decided to go to the mountains. When they first entered the caves, I tried to explain the landscape of like, as you're walking, you see rocks like playing tag with each other. You see crystals in the caves like pulsating and making noises. Try to make it like feel really eerie and strange and odd, as that's what the Fey realm was all about. Then as they were walking, they heard this thumping coming in the distance, like bum bum bum. I explained it as like someone taking a large piece of log and like banging it on the ground, or like a shovel and banging it on a rock wall. They heard it coming from the distance. So Thedon went investigated, and then when he came back, he told him it's just like a bunch of little furry dudes dancing. And so they asked like, should we keep going because these guys are like in an outcropping, but the cave actually continues, or should we go back? And they asked Waldo for his advice, and he was very torn. He's like, oh, I don't know, I'm not sure, I don't think I want to go. So then during this time, Tink pulled like New Girl's Nick, like, okay, I'm gonna go. And so Tink and Theron went and investigated, and they kind of became seen as they looked at these little furry people, and they pushed this rock up against the entrance that like filled the entrance thing of like a big boulder, and they were talking different language through like a peephole in the bottom, like dun 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 dun. So Theron went and got the party, and he's like, hey, they're talking a language I don't understand, can you guys come translate? And then Waldo was convinced like, okay, let's go help them. So they all went down, and they talked to him, and they introduced themselves as Dun Dun and Bum 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 and Gum Gum and Zum and a bunch of other fun names. I tried to base these characters on the Dun Dun guy from Night at the Museum, the statue guy, because I love that voice. I know Dum Dum, you want Gum Gum. So I try to just incorporate that. And these guys are Chorids is their race, and what these creatures do is every week or so they get together randomly. They're normally like isolated beings, but like every once in a while they'll get together and they have like this festival type thing where they dance and make music to celebrate gems and rocks. So that's what they stumbled upon. And they're chaotic creatures, so they're not gonna like attack anyone. They're just neutral. They're just looking out for themselves. So they pointed them like down, like, oh, you guys looking for Tethra? And they're like, who's Tethra? And they're like, oh, Tethra's good. I just keep going out, but look out for this big lizard. It's bad. So they kept walking down, like, oh, watch out for the lizard or something. And then the cave went down more as they kept walking, and it started to open up. Ground from went from dark to like a sandy white looking color, and the crystals became more blue in color. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, this little creature who has big head with a big nose and a big underbite with teeth all in random directions and big old ears and yellow eyes jumped out and said "Woo!" and tried to scare him. And these were my Boggle characters, which I'll put up on the screen now. These guys are basically little boogeymen of the Fae, and they are like a mix. I gave them the voice of like Gollum mixed with the It Clown, and they are like very docile but very like, we'll bite your fingers off, but we also like love shiny things, and we also want to scare you, but we're also very playful, like little children basically. So they led them down this path. We're like, oh, Tethra's this way. So they led them to Tethra. Tethra was basically a Fomorian sitting on a humongous kitchen chair, and I presented her with her big eye, and then that's where I called the session. So overall, I thought the session was more of a building up type of session, so there wasn't a lot of action. I thought the role playing was great. There were some questions that people asked others out of character, and then those players would respond in character, which I absolutely loved. I do think that I could have done better as far as explaining the direction and what you see and how big everything was. They had a lot of clarifying questions. I also, like I mentioned earlier, could have potentially portrayed the portal room a little bit better. However, I thought I did a really good job at explaining the strangeness and the coolness of the Fae realm. I thought my players were really giddy, like, oh my gosh, I want to go to all these different places, or like, oh, these are really cool concepts, which I came up all with my own. There isn't a lot of material on the Fae realm on what it is, other than it's like really random and your emotions are related, so I just kind of took that and ran with it. So I'm excited to see what happens with this plot line, as Tethra is going to demand that they kill a big lizard, and the lizard is going to demand that they kill Tethra the Fomorian, and they both have equal reasons for doing so. If anything, I think Tethra's side has more reason to kill the Topaz Dragon, who murdered the clan of Shadow Goblins that lives with Tethra, but we'll see what the players decide to do. So stay tuned and we'll see what happens next time. So bye-bye!